and continuing coverage of the Arizona gubernatorial midterm election trial, early this morning, Kari Lake's legal team presented their case to the Arizona's county court. Her case pertains to alleged voter disenfranchisement, illegal voting, and more, accusing her opponent, Governor-elect Katie Hobbs, governor-elect, of malicious intent. And although earlier this week she was expected to, Governor-elect Katie Hobbs did not testify and will not, according to all available evidence. This after on Wednesday when Kari Lake's lawyers withdrew the subpoena requesting her to do so. But not to worry, Kari Lake has made it very clear that need be, she will take this case all the way up to the Supreme Court. Will that happen? Criminal defense attorney Bob Bianchi joins me now with a legal perspective on this. Bob, it's great to have you. Do you think that this is a case, obviously a lot of controversy in Arizona, do you think this is something that could make its way to the Supreme Court?
Not likely, Addison. The real issue here is going to be whether or not a lower court, that's a fact-finding court. The Supreme Court is not a fact-finding court. Whether or not they believe three things happened, essentially. One, whether or not these printers in particular, malfunctions with these printers were purposefully and intentionally done. Number two, whether they affected the votes that would have been in favor of the candidate, in this case, Ms. Lake. And number three, whether or not those affected votes would have changed the outcome of the election. That is something that's going to be handled below or beneath the Supreme Court level. If later on there's a ruling that they believe was legally incorrect, that's when they could start moving towards the courts. But the Supreme Court has already demonstrated over and over again, when we look at former President Trump's cases, that they're not, they have no appetite to get involved in rulings of lower courts that have already determined these issues.
Now, I want to switch gears and talk about Sam Bankman-Fried. This is big news that came down the pipeline this morning. Bankman-Fried is set to return to the United States from the Bahamas to face his charges. So at first they dropped his objection to extradition. He was going to object. He has dropped that. He is coming back to the U.S. Bob, obviously, anyone who's been following the news knows this is what looks to be one of the biggest Ponzi schemes, biggest frauds in United States history. How do you think this is going to play out for Sam Bankman-Fried? What are the charges he's looking at, and how much prison time could he be facing?
Well, he's looking at excess if you look at these charges of 100 years in prison. I mean, he's looking at Bernie Madoff kind of time here without any question about it. But this case is different than the Madoff case because in this particular case, what is being alleged is that he was actually deceiving the investors and taking the money from his company, putting it into a shell company that he claims, he started, that he claims he had no involvement with, but the facts seem to suggest that he did, and therefore was taking their money and putting it into another company that was making highly risky investments. The other thing that's really interesting about this case, Addison, is I watched an hour-long interview that he had done with a journalist who was just really, really well prepared. I think it was New York Times, but this is something he should not be doing. Essentially, he wants to say it's like, I didn't know, and maybe things got out of control, but the journalists and people that have questioned him are really drilling down and locking him into some very bad testimony. He even says himself in one of the interviews that my lawyers are basically losing their minds. They don't want me to talk, but I'm going to do the right thing and speak. But what he's done is he sewed himself into probably a conviction.
Yeah, and he's also tried to play kind of the ignorant shtick, oh, I'm so sorry, this is all terrible, everything that happened is so wrong, but it wasn't my fault, I didn't mean to, I didn't intend for any of this to happen. We're talking about $8 to $10 billion stolen from people. Intent hardly even matters at that point, right, Bob?
Yeah, I mean, it does, but it's going to be very difficult to try to say that I am the founder of two companies, one of which I'm intimately involved in, and I am taking billions of dollars for company A that specifically has a user agreement that says I will not use it for anything other than company A, and then taking it, moving it into the company B, which he wants to distance himself from, but he can't factually, and then putting money into all sorts of risky investments, political campaigns, and things of that nature. These people had no idea that and were in fact told their money would not be used for that. The prosecutors, he's not going to come right out and say, Addison, like most criminal defendants don't do, and say, yeah, I knew I did it and it was wrong to do, because then he'd be guilty. But prosecutors will use the circumstantial evidence to show that there would be no way that he had no knowledge that this was going on in his company. So he could say it, but again, I think that the statements that he's already made have belied the idea that he had no idea what was going on, and the paper trail is going to be immense.
Bob, last question. When we're talking about all of this money that he's reportedly defrauded investors of, if and when he is charged, he's convicted, he's sentenced to prison, how will investors get any of their money back? Will they get some of their money back? How would that usually work legally? Because, you know, for all we know, Sam Bankman-Fried doesn't have much more money left his name, certainly not enough to pay back these investors. How would that work from a legal standpoint?
I think it's going to be very difficult for them to get their money back, although he did make a comment in one interview that I found very intriguing. I don't know if it's true, of course, but he claims that all of the money from his company that was trading in American markets is protected and collateralized, but with regard to the foreign markets, it may not be. But I don't believe that that's going to turn out to be accurate. But if it is accurate, that's where they're going to go to try to help recompensate some of these victims. But it's very difficult for me to imagine that people are going to get a lot of their investment back, Addison. It's a shame. That's what happens in these cases.
Yeah, especially someone like Tom Brady, who had who had tens of millions, hundreds of millions potentially of dollars tied up in this. It's the whole thing is just, it's really is shocking. Bob Bianchi from Law and Crime Network, thank you so much for joining the show. It's always great to have you.
Of course. Thanks, Addison.